Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. Tonight, get ready for an unforgettable journey into the world of spine-chilling, scary stories. Each story is crafted to stir fear and suspense, perfectly accompanied by the calming sound of rain to help you unwind as you drift off to sleep. Let us know your location and the time you're tuning in by dropping a comment below. If these eerie tales send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, dim the lights, sit back, relax, and let the scary stories take you on a haunting journey. The first time it happened, I dismissed it as a coincidence, a dream, nothing more. But now, as I sit in this dimly lit motel room, trembling hands clutching a half-empty bottle of whiskey, I can't shake the feeling that I'm next. The nightmares are never wrong. It started 3 months ago on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. My name is Eric Walsh, and I'm a freelance photographer based in Denver, Colorado. I make a living snapping pictures of nature, cityscapes, and the occasional wedding. That night, I passed out on my couch after a grueling day of editing. I remember the dream vividly, down to the smallest horrifying detail. I was standing in a dark, unfamiliar forest, surrounded by towering skeletal trees. The air reeked of decay. In the distance, a figure was running, stumbling really, through the underbrush. Their frantic gasps and the crunch of dead leaves underfoot filled the silence. I wanted to call out, but my throat felt sewn shut. Then I saw it. A shadow, darker than the night itself, slithered through the trees, moving with impossible speed. It wasn't human. The thing had no face, just a shifting void where a face should be. The runner tripped, falling hard onto the forest floor. The shadow engulfed them, and the last thing I heard before I woke up was their scream, raw, guttural, and filled with despair. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a war drum. The clock read 3:17 a.m. Shaking it off, I chalked it up to stress and a late-night burrito. But 2 days later, I saw the news. A woman named Allison Burke had been found dead in a forest near Boulder, her body twisted and broken as if she'd been running from something. The image of her face on the news report froze me in place. She was the runner from my dream. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd seen her photo somewhere before and my subconscious had cooked up the nightmare. But the details were too exact. The forest, the screams, the time of death. A week later, it happened again. This time, the dream took me to an abandoned gas station. The flickering fluorescent lights hummed like angry bees, casting long shadows across cracked pavement. A man was slumped against the wall, blood pooling around him. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as he tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow appeared again, slinking out of the darkness like a predator that had found its prey. I wanted to help, but my feet were rooted to the ground. It reached him, and his eyes widened in terror before the shadow consumed him. I jolted awake, my pulse racing. The next day, I saw the report. A man named Trevor Langley had been found dead at an old, abandoned gas station off Route 34. His injuries matched the ones I'd seen in my dream. By the third nightmare, I knew I wasn't crazy. It was a middle-aged man this time, sitting alone in a diner. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. He was sipping coffee, but his hands were shaking so badly that the liquid spilled onto the table. I heard the door creak open, but when I turned to look, no one was there. Just the shadow. It slid across the floor like smoke, circling the man as he begged for his life. I wanted to scream, to warn him, but the words wouldn't come. The shadow lunged, and the man's screams echoed in my ears as I woke up. That morning, I called the cops. I reported a hunch that something bad would happen at a diner downtown. They probably thought I was nuts, but they sent someone to check it out. Too late. By the time they got there, the man was already dead. I started to dread sleep. No amount of coffee or energy drinks could keep me awake forever, and when exhaustion won, the nightmares came back, each one more vivid than the last. The shadow was always there, claiming another victim, and every time, the deaths became more brutal. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what was happening. I scoured news articles, police reports, even paranormal forums, looking for answers. Was it some kind of curse? A premonition? Or was I somehow causing these deaths by dreaming about them? I found a pattern. Each victim had a connection to me, no matter how small. Allison Burke was a high school classmate I hadn't seen in years. Trevor Langley had once bought one of my photographs at a gallery, the man in the diner. He'd been my landlord 5 years ago. Last night, I dreamed of myself. I was back in my childhood home, standing in the bedroom where I used to sleep. The air felt heavy, suffocating. The shadow was there, waiting for me. It didn't attack. It just watched. When I woke up, my phone was ringing. It was Detective Harper, the cop I'd spoken to after the diner incident. She told me something that made my blood run cold. I don't know how to say this, Walsh, but we've been digging into these deaths, and there's a lot that doesn't add up. Witnesses claimed to have seen a man matching your description near the crime scenes. That's impossible, I stammered. I was asleep during all of them. That's the thing, she said. We found your fingerprints at the diner and the gas station. Can you explain that? I hung up and packed a bag. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out of Denver. The shadow was closing in, and if Detective Harper's suspicions were right, I might not be as innocent as I thought. Now, as I sit in this dingy motel room, sleep-deprived and terrified, I can feel it watching me. The shadow is here. It's always been here. The thing I can't figure out, the thing that's driving me insane, is whether I've been dreaming about these murders, or committing them. Tonight, I'm afraid to close my eyes. Because if I do, I might not wake up. And if I do wake up, I don't know who or what I'll be. The first time I saw her, she was standing ankle-deep in the lake, her pale figure shimmering under the faint moonlight like she had been carved from the mist itself. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Exhaustion, I told myself. But as I stood frozen on the shore, my flashlight trembling in my hands, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes weren't human. I'd never planned on spending a weekend in a cabin by Whispering Pines Lake. My older brother, Eric, had insisted. "You need this, Alex," he'd said. "A couple of days away from the grind. The lake is serene, and the cabin's cozy. It'll be good for your head." What he didn't tell me was how desolate this place was. The nearest sign of life was a gas station 15 miles down a winding dirt road. The cabin itself wasn't much. Rickety floorboards, a fireplace that looked more decorative than functional, and a view of the lake that would have been beautiful if it didn't feel so wrong. By the second night, I was ready to pack up and leave. The silence pressed against my ears, suffocating in its weight. The lake shimmered in the dark like a black mirror, its surface too still, too perfect. That's when I decided to take a walk. I needed to clear my head, maybe convince myself I wasn't going crazy. And that's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was an animal. The way she stood so still, blending into the fog rolling off the water, made her look like part of the landscape. But as I approached, my stomach twisted into knots. She was wearing a long, flowing dress, torn at the hem as though she'd been wading through brambles. Her hair was dark and matted, sticking to her pale, expressionless face. And those eyes. God, those eyes. They were like empty sockets, pools of endless blackness that seemed to swallow the moonlight. "Hey," I called out before I could think better of it. Her head snapped toward me with an unnatural speed, her body unmoving. My breath hitched. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then, without a sound, she turned and drifted into the lake. I don't remember running back to the cabin, but I do remember the sensation of cold, like something was gripping my chest and refusing to let go. The next morning I convinced myself it was a nightmare. Stress, isolation, maybe too much whiskey by the fire. But when I walked down to the lake to reassure myself, I saw footprints in the sand. Small, bare footprints that led from the water to the very spot where I'd seen her. I told myself it was nothing. I buried my unease under coffee and an audiobook, trying to ignore the way the lake seemed to draw my eyes back to it. By the time the sun set, the unease had festered into dread. The air grew colder, sharper, as if the approaching night carried a warning. I locked the doors, built a fire, and poured another drink. The crackle of the flames was the only sound in the cabin. No wind, no chirping insects, just silence, heavy and oppressive. Around midnight, the scratching began. It started faint, like the wind brushing against the windows. But the longer I sat, the louder it grew. A deliberate, insistent scraping. My chest tightened. I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the front door, half expecting to find some animal pawing at the wood. When I opened the door, the night was empty. But then I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like bare feet slapping against wet earth. I swung the flashlight toward the lake, and there she was. This time she was closer, standing on the shore with her dress clinging to her soaked frame, her head tilted as though she were studying me. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice breaking. She took a step forward. The beam of the flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought she would vanish into the dark again. But she didn't. She kept coming, her movements jerky and unnatural. I slammed the door and bolted it, my hands shaking. The scratching started again, but now it was louder, more desperate. I backed away, clutching the flashlight like a weapon, my mind racing. Who was she? What did she want? And then it hit me, the gas station attendant. He'd warned me about the lake. "Strange things happen there," he'd said, his eyes narrowing. "People talk about a ghostly lady who haunts the water. They say she's looking for something, or someone. Best not to linger too long near the lake." At the time, I'd laughed it off as small-town superstition. But now the memory clawed at my mind like a warning I'd been too arrogant to heed. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those hollow, unblinking eyes. The way her head moved like it was being pulled by invisible strings. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. I threw my bags into the car, not even bothering to tidy up the cabin. But as I started the engine, I noticed something strange. The lake wasn't there. In its place was a dry, cracked basin, the muddy bottom stretching as far as I could see. It was as though the water had been drained overnight, leaving nothing behind but a lifeless void. I should have driven away then and there. But something compelled me to step out of the car and walk toward the empty lakebed. About halfway across, I saw her. She was lying in the mud, her body twisted at an impossible angle, her dark hair splayed around her like a veil. Her dress was torn and dirtied, but her face was the same, pale, hollow, and staring. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then her head jerked toward me. The ground beneath me gave way, and I felt myself sinking, the mud swallowing my legs. Her mouth opened, a silent scream spilling forth, and the world seemed to collapse around me. I woke up in the cabin, drenched in sweat and gasping for air. The sun was shining, the lake was back, and everything seemed normal. But when I looked at my hands, they were caked in mud. I left that day. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. The image of her twisted body burned into my mind. Even now, back in the city, I can't escape her. I see her face in reflections, hear her soft, wet footsteps in the dead of night. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I feel the cold grip of the mud pulling me under. I don't know what she wanted or why she chose me, but I know this. She's still out there, waiting by the lake, and someday, she'll come for me again. I still hear it sometimes, late at night when the world falls silent. A wail, distant and faint but undeniably real. It claws its way through the stillness, a sound so mournful and haunting that it chills me to the bone. If I close my eyes, I can almost see her again. The Banshee. My name is Liam O'Connor, and I live in a quiet village on the western coast of Ireland. The cliffs here are high, jagged, and unforgiving. The ocean below churns endlessly, a gray expanse that seems to stretch into eternity. The people here are simple folk, deeply rooted in tradition and superstition. Growing up, I always thought the stories were just that, stories. A banshee wailing in the night to herald death? A phantom woman draped in sorrow and despair. It all sounded like the kind of thing parents told to keep their children indoors after dark. I never believed any of it, until that night. It was late October, just a few days before Samhain, the time when the veil between the living and the dead is said to be thinnest. I had spent the day helping my uncle repair the thatched roof of his cottage, and by the time I left, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale, ghostly light over the landscape. The path home wound along the cliffs, a narrow dirt trail bordered by wild gorse and heather. The wind howled as I walked, tugging at my coat and biting at my skin. I pulled the fabric tighter around me and quickened my pace. The night felt heavier than usual, the shadows darker and more oppressive. I tried to shake off the unease creeping over me, blaming it on fatigue and the eerie stillness of the countryside. That's when I heard it. A low, keening wail floated on the wind, faint but unmistakable. It was a sound unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mix of sorrow and rage, raw and primal. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, rising and falling like the tide. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. The cliffs loomed to my left, the black ocean roiling below. To my right, the wild fields stretched into the shadows, dotted with ancient stone markers that locals claimed were remnants of the Fae. But there was no one in sight. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my effort to sound confident. Silence. Then, the wail came again, louder this time, closer. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I felt an icy dread settle over me, heavy and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the ground. That's when I saw her. She stood at the edge of the cliffs, her back to me. Her figure was draped in tattered, flowing garments that fluttered in the wind, blending into the night like mist. Her long silver hair cascaded down her back, catching the moonlight in a way that made it shimmer like spun silk. For a moment, I thought she might be a lost villager or a traveler in trouble, but something about her presence felt wrong. I took a hesitant step forward. "Miss, are you all right?" She turned then, slowly, as if moving through water. Her face was pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Her lips were parted, and from them came that haunting wail, a sound that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. She began to glide toward me, her feet not touching the earth. My mind raced, panic overtaking reason. This couldn't be real. It had to be a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But the cold seeping into my bones told me otherwise. As she approached, I noticed something clutched in her skeletal hands, a comb carved from bone and polished to an otherworldly shine. I remembered the stories then, the warnings whispered by old-timers in the pub. "If you find a comb on the ground, never pick it up. The banshee uses it to lure her victims." I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The banshee stopped a few feet away, her wail fading into a low, guttural moan. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of despair wash over me, so profound that it nearly brought me to my knees. Images flooded my mind, faces I recognized, people I loved, all of them lifeless and cold. "No," I whispered, shaking my head as if I could dispel the visions. "This isn't real." She raised the comb, holding it out to me. Her lips moved, but no sound came, and yet I understood her all the same. "Take it." I shook my head, backing away. "Number, I don't want it." Her expression twisted into something monstrous, her features contorting with rage. She let out a scream so piercing that I clapped my hands over my ears, falling to the ground once more. The earth seemed to tremble beneath me, and the wind roared like a living thing. I was sure I was going to die, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I opened my eyes cautiously. The banshee was gone. The night was still, the only sound the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move. When I finally made it home, I bolted the door behind me and collapsed into a chair by the fire. My mother noticed my pallor and asked what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? The next morning, the news spread through the village. Old Seamus, the blacksmith, had passed away in his sleep. I thought of the banshee's wail, the sorrow in her eyes. The stories had been true all along. She was a harbinger of death, a warning of the inevitable. For weeks, I avoided the cliffs, terrified of encountering her again. But the memory of that night stayed with me, haunting my dreams and coloring my days with a lingering unease. I began to notice other things, too. Small, strange occurrences that I couldn't explain. A chill in the air when there was no wind. A shadow moving in the corner of my eye. The faint sound of a wail just on the edge of hearing. And then, one night, it happened again. I was alone in the cottage, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The hour was late, and I was just about to head to bed when I heard it. The banshee's wail, faint but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. I knew what it meant. This time, I didn't go looking for her. I stayed inside, clutching a rosary in trembling hands and praying for the strength to endure whatever came next. The wail grew louder, closer, until it seemed to fill the room. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The next morning, I found out that my neighbor, young Eyewife, had died in a freak accident. She had slipped on the rocks by the shore and drowned before anyone could reach her. The banshee's warning had come too late. I don't know why she chose me, why I am the one who hears her cries. But I know this much. The banshee is real. She is out there, wandering the cliffs, mourning the dead before they are even gone. And when she wails, it is a sound you will never forget. So if you ever find yourself walking alone at night, and you hear a cry on the wind, heed my warning. Do not follow it. Do not look for her. Because once you see her, you will never be the same. The ice cracked beneath my boots with a sound like distant gunfire. For a moment, I froze, literally and figuratively. Out here, on the unending expanse of white, even the smallest sound could mean danger. But this was more than just danger. This was something else entirely. I wasn't supposed to be here, no one was. I'd signed up for the Arctic research expedition thinking it would be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to escape the monotony of life back in Minnesota. A month at Ice Station Epsilon, documenting shifts in glacial patterns and permafrost levels. Easy, right? I'd been here for 3 weeks, and I could already feel the chill eating into my bones, a relentless cold that even the station's heaters couldn't fight off. But that wasn't the worst of it. It was the nights. The howling wind carried sounds that didn't belong, whispers in a language I couldn't understand. At first, I thought it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But last night, while I was cataloging ice core samples alone in the lab, I swear I heard my name. A faint, guttural whisper. Then, no one else had heard it, of course. I mentioned it to Dr. Harris, the lead scientist, but she waved it off. Auditory pareidolia, she said with a dismissive shrug. The mind finds patterns in randomness. I wasn't so sure. This morning, when the radio crackled with a distress call, I felt a twinge of relief. Anything to break the monotony and hopefully distract me from the creeping unease. The message was garbled, barely coherent. Coordinates. Northwest. Something. Moving under the... Dr. Harris decided to investigate, bringing me and two others, Novak and Martinez, along for the ride. We loaded into the snowcat and set off toward the given coordinates, the low rumble of the engine the only sound in the otherwise deathly silent wilderness. The coordinates led us to a desolate patch of ice, nothing remarkable about it at first glance. We stepped out of the vehicle, and that's when I heard it again. A whisper. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Novak replied, his voice muffled by his scarf. But I knew what I'd heard. My name again, carried on the wind. Dr. Harris knelt by a jagged crack in the ice, her brow furrowed. "Looks like some sort of subglacial activity," she muttered. "Could be a tectonic shift or a methane release." Martinez looked uneasy. "This crack's fresh. Shouldn't we, I don't know, wait for the geophysics team to check it out?" Harris shook her head. "We're here now. Might as well take some preliminary data." The equipment we brought detected something unusual almost immediately. Beneath the crack, there was a vast cavern filled with water. A subglacial lake, untouched by sunlight for millennia. But it wasn't the lake that set my teeth on edge. It was the heat signature. "What the hell is that?" Novak muttered, staring at the thermal imaging device. The screen showed a pulsing red mass, large and irregular, moving slowly beneath the ice. At first I thought it might be some kind of thermal anomaly, maybe volcanic activity, but it was too rhythmic, too deliberate, alive. "Could be a school of fish," Harris suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "Fish?" Martinez scoffed. "In a lake sealed off for millions of years? No way." Dr. Harris ignored him. "We need a sample." She set up the drill, its loud mechanical whine piercing the frigid air. I stood back, my heart pounding with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. As the drill bit deeper, the whispering grew louder in my ears, more insistent. "Don't open it." When the drill finally broke through, there was a hiss of air escaping the cavity below. The first sample we pulled up wasn't water. It was something thick, black, and viscous, like tar. "This isn't right," Novak said, backing away. Harris, however, was fascinated. "Could be microbial life," she murmured, holding up the sample vial to the pale sunlight. "Microbial life doesn't move," I pointed out. Because it was moving. The substance in the vial was shifting, writhing as though it had a mind of its own. Harris dismissed my concern, calling it a natural reaction to exposure. I wasn't convinced. That night, back at the station, things went from bad to worse. We were examining the black substance under a microscope when Novak screamed. I spun around to see him clawing at his arm, ripping off his jacket. Beneath the fabric, his skin bulged unnaturally, as though something was crawling beneath it. "Oh my God, get it off!" he yelled, his voice cracking. Martinez grabbed a scalpel and sliced into Novak's arm. A black tendril, slick and glistening, slithered out, writhing on the table before collapsing into a puddle of goo. "What the hell is that?" Martinez shouted, backing away. Dr. Harris was uncharacteristically silent, her face pale. Novak was shaking, his breathing ragged. "It was in the vial. I touched it when we were drilling." That was when the alarms went off. The station's motion sensors, designed to detect polar bears, had picked up something massive. Something that wasn't a bear. We scrambled to the control room, staring at the monitor. The thermal camera showed the same pulsing red mass from earlier, only now it was much closer, directly beneath the station. Then the ground began to shake. Panic set in quickly. Novak was still writhing in pain, black veins spidering out from the wound on his arm. Martinez tried to radio for help, but the signal was nothing but static. "We need to leave," I said, grabbing my coat. And go where? Harris snapped. We're hundreds of miles from the nearest outpost. Before anyone could respond, there was a deafening crack. The floor beneath us split open, and the entire station tilted violently to one side. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, I saw it. The ice below had fractured completely, revealing a yawning black abyss. Rising from the depths was something I can barely describe. A mass of writhing tendrils, slick and glistening like the substance in the vial. It moved with a horrifying intelligence, each tendril probing, searching. Harris screamed as one of the tendrils wrapped around her leg, yanking her toward the abyss. I tried to grab her, but she was gone before I could reach her, swallowed by the darkness. Martinez and I ran. Novak was already dead, consumed by whatever was spreading through his body. The snowcat was our only hope. We barely made it. The creature, whatever it was, seemed reluctant to leave the warmth of the subglacial lake, retreating back into the fissure as we sped away. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. We made it to a nearby outpost 2 days later, half frozen and delirious. Martinez wouldn't talk about what we'd seen, and I couldn't blame him. No one believed us, of course. The official report blamed a methane explosion for the destruction of Ice Station Epsilon. But I know the truth. Some things should stay buried. Some monsters are better left beneath the ice. I had always been fascinated by zoos. Not just the animals, but the eerie quiet that settles over the place after hours, when the crowds are gone, and it's just you and the creatures. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 32, a wildlife photographer based out of Denver, Colorado. Last year, I was hired for an assignment that seemed too good to be true. A week at the infamous St. Clair Zoo in Louisiana. The zoo had been abandoned for decades, yet rumors swirled about strange sightings and sounds that plagued the grounds. It was my job to photograph the dilapidated enclosures and document the eerie beauty of nature reclaiming the place. When I first arrived, the air felt different, heavier. The once bustling ticket booths were overgrown with vines, and rusted cages sat empty, their bars bent and twisted like they had been pried open from the inside. A storm was rolling in, but I pushed forward, eager to capture the perfect shot before the rain started. That's when I heard it, the low rumble of a growl, deep and guttural, coming from the direction of the old lion enclosure. I froze, my camera in hand, every nerve in my body on high alert. The zoo had been abandoned for 30 years. There were no animals left. At least, none that were supposed to be alive. The caretaker, a wiry old man named Eugene, showed me to the small cabin where I'd be staying. "You'll hear things," he said in a gravelly voice as he handed me the key. "Don't go investigating at night. This place, it's not right." I laughed nervously. "What kind of things?" Eugene looked me dead in the eye. "Animals, people, sometimes both." I chalked it up to local superstition, a way to scare off trespassers, and unpacked my gear. By the time night fell, the storm was in full swing. Rain lashed against the cabin windows, and the wind howled through the trees like a wounded animal. I tried to sleep, but around midnight, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A series of high-pitched, chattering sounds, almost like laughter. It was coming from outside. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a path leading to the old monkey house. The laughter grew louder, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, a flash of white darting behind a tree. My hand trembled as I locked the door and crawled back into bed, but sleep never came. The next morning, I made my way to the monkey house. It was one of the few structures still standing, though the roof had partially caved in, and the smell of decay hung heavy in the air. The cages were empty, but as I snapped pictures, I noticed something strange. Claw marks etched deep into the metal bars, as if something had tried to escape, or maybe something had tried to get in. I found a notebook lying on the floor, its pages damp and yellowed with age. Flipping through it, I realized it belonged to a zookeeper named Margaret. Her entries grew more frantic as the days went on. June 14th, 1989. The animals are restless. They won't eat. The monkeys keep staring at something in the corner of their enclosure, but when I look, there's nothing there. June 21st, 1989. Staff is quitting. 3 keepers have reported hearing voices coming from the tiger pen at night. I heard it too. A child's voice, laughing. June 30th, 1989. They're gone. All of them. The monkeys, the lions, the bears. Every cage is empty, but the locks weren't broken. They just left. The final entry was scrawled in large, shaky letters. It's not the animals. It's what's in here with them. By the 3rd day, I was ready to leave. The atmosphere was oppressive, and I felt like I was being watched everywhere I went. But I needed more shots to finish the assignment, so I ventured into the underground tunnel system that connected the enclosures. The zoo had used it to transport food and supplies, but now it was pitch black, the air thick with mildew. As I descended, my flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the damp concrete walls. About halfway through, I noticed something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A set of footprints, wet and muddy, leading deeper into the tunnel. They were too large to be human, but too narrow to belong to any animal I could think of. I followed them, my heart pounding, until the tunnel opened into a small chamber. In the center of the room was a pile of bones. Animal bones, by the looks of them. But they were arranged in a pattern, almost like a ritual. The flashlight flickered again, and that's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and spindly, moving across the wall even though there was nothing to cast it. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The shadow stopped. Then it turned. 2 glowing eyes appeared in the darkness, and a low growl filled the chamber. I ran, not daring to look back, and didn't stop until I was out of the tunnel and back in the daylight. That evening, I confronted Eugene. "What happened here?" I demanded. "What's in those tunnels?" Eugene sighed, his face pale. "It's not just one thing, this place, it's cursed. The zoo was built on old swampland, sacred to the local tribes. The animals started acting strange right after the opening. They'd attack the keepers for no reason, tear at their own enclosures, and then people started disappearing." "Disappearing?" I echoed. "The animals too," he said. "One night a whole pride of lions vanished without a trace. The next day, the monkeys were gone. By the time the zoo shut down, there was nothing left but the sounds." "What sounds?" Eugene leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Voices, growls, screams. Some say the animals never really left. They're still here, but different. On my last night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows felt like an omen. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The laughter. It was louder this time, and it was coming from inside the cabin. I grabbed my camera, hoping to capture whatever it was. The laughter stopped as I stepped into the hallway, replaced by a low, wet, slurping sound. My flashlight flickered, and I saw something at the end of the hall, a figure hunched over, its back turned to me. It was pale and hairless, its spine protruding sharply through its skin. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure turned, and I felt my knees go weak. Its face was an amalgamation of features, human, animal, and something else entirely. Its eyes glowed like molten gold, and its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I snapped a photo out of instinct, and the flash startled it. The creature let out a deafening roar, and I bolted for the door, not stopping until I reached my car. I drove away, leaving my belongings behind, and never looked back. When I developed the photos, most were blurred or overexposed except for one, the final shot. The creature's face stared back at me, its golden eyes burning through the image. I tried to show it to others, but no one believed me. They said it was doctored, a trick of the light. But I know what I saw. The zoo may be abandoned, but it's not empty. Something still roams those grounds, something that's neither human nor animal. And it's waiting. For what? I don't want to know. The wind had a voice that night. Not a howl, not a whistle, but a voice. Soft, deliberate, and maddeningly clear. At first, I thought it was the heat playing tricks on my mind. But as the whispers grew louder, closer, and more insistent, I realized something else was out there. Alone in the desert, with miles of barren land stretching in every direction, the one thing I could be certain of was this. I wasn't as alone as I thought. My name is Jack Daniels. Yeah, like the whiskey. My dad had a sense of humor. And I'm a 34-year-old freelance photographer. A few weeks ago, I accepted a gig to capture the stark, eerie beauty of the Mojave Desert at night. The client, a faceless company that only communicated through emails, offered a fat paycheck for shots of abandoned mines and long-forgotten trails under the full moon. It sounded like easy money. I couldn't have been more wrong. I set up camp near the ruins of a ghost town called Blackwell. It wasn't much of a town, just a scattering of collapsed shacks and the skeletal remains of a saloon. The map I'd been given showed a trail leading to an old silver mine about 3 miles out, and that was my first destination. The moon was high and full, casting a ghostly glow over the desert. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the cracked earth as I walked, my camera strapped around my neck and a flashlight in hand. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of my boots and the occasional scurry of unseen critters. Then I heard it, the whisper. At first, it was so faint I thought it was the wind slipping through the rocks. But it came again, and this time it carried words. Turn back. I froze, my heart pounding. I swept the flashlight around, but there was nothing. Just rocks and sand and the endless void of the desert night. Hello? My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vast emptiness. No response. The wind stilled, and the air felt heavy, suffocating. Shaking it off, I pressed on. Ghost towns had their fair share of spooky legends, and I figured my mind was just running wild in the silence. I had a job to do. The entrance to the mine was a gaping black hole in the side of a hill, its wooden supports splintered and sagging with age. A rusted sign hung crookedly above the opening, the words, Blackwell Mine, Danger, Do Not Enter, barely visible in the moonlight. Ignoring every horror movie instinct I'd ever developed, I stepped inside. The air was cool and damp, a stark contrast to the dry heat outside. My flashlight's beam danced across the walls, revealing jagged rock and a long-forgotten mining cart tipped on its side. I set up my tripod and began snapping pictures, the flash illuminating the tunnel in bursts of harsh light. That's when I saw it, something in the corner of the frame. A shadow, human-shaped but distorted, like it was stretched too tall and too thin. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand, but the tunnel was empty. Hello? My voice echoed down the passage, swallowed by the dark. No answer. I checked the camera's screen. The photo was there, but the shadow was gone. Just a trick of the light, I told myself. Still, I packed up and left the mine, every instinct screaming at me to put as much distance as possible between me and that place. Back at camp, sleep didn't come easily. The whispers had followed me, weaving through the wind like an unseen chorus. I tried blasting music through my headphones, but even that didn't drown them out. I swear I heard my name, soft, drawn out, and chilling. Jack! I bolted upright, yanking the headphones off. My flashlight flicked on, the beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the desert stretching endlessly under the moonlight. I barely slept, and when dawn came, I debated packing up and leaving. But the paycheck was too good, and my pride wouldn't let me run from what I convinced myself was just paranoia. That evening, I decided to hike to an old trail marked on the map. It was supposed to lead to a dry riverbed dotted with petroglyphs, and I figured it'd be a safer spot for photos than the mine. The trail was easy to follow at first, winding through a narrow canyon that felt unnaturally quiet. Even the insects seemed to avoid the place. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the whispers returned. This time they weren't faint. They were all around me, overlapping and urgent, like a crowd pressing in close. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but the tone was desperate, warning. I quickened my pace, the flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. The canyon walls seemed to close in, the darkness thickening. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the trail, silhouetted against the rising moon. "Hey!" I called, relief flooding me at the sight of another person. But as I got closer, that relief turned to dread. The figure wasn't standing, it was floating. Its feet didn't touch the ground, and its body was wrong, too elongated and thin. Its face was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale skin. And then it turned its head, slowly, unnaturally, and looked at me, though it had no eyes. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. My feet pounded the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The whispers chased me, rising into a cacophony that drowned out my own panicked heartbeat. When I finally stumbled back into camp, I collapsed by the fire pit, shaking uncontrollably. The whispers had stopped, but the memory of that faceless figure was burned into my mind. I packed my gear as soon as the sun rose, determined to get out of that cursed desert. But as I loaded the last of my equipment into the truck, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My camera, still attached to the tripod, had been turned to face me, and the lens cap was off. I hadn't touched it since I fled the canyon. With trembling hands, I turned on the camera and scrolled through the photos. The last image wasn't one I had taken. It was a picture of me, sitting by the fire pit the previous night. But the angle was all wrong. It was taken from above, as if someone, or something, had been watching me. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, was the faceless figure, standing just outside the ring of firelight. I didn't bother packing the rest of my things. I jumped in the truck and tore down the dirt road, the dust kicking up behind me. The whispers followed me for miles, growing fainter until they finally disappeared. I never sent the photos to the client, never even tried to contact them again. I still have the camera, but I haven't touched it since. Sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I hear the whispers again, calling my name, and I wonder if I ever truly left the desert, or if it came with me. The first time I saw her, I was at 30,000 feet, wedged into a middle seat between a businessman glued to his laptop and a teenager snoring with his headphones still on. The plane had hit turbulence, a particularly jarring bout that had every passenger clutching their armrests. And when I looked up, she was standing in the aisle. She shouldn't have been there. Her hair hung wet and stringy down her back, dripping onto the carpeted floor, leaving dark stains that no one seemed to notice. Her clothes, if you could call them that, looked like a tattered, waterlogged dress clinging to her frame. But it was her eyes that froze me. Sunken, dark, and void of life, they locked onto mine, and a chill seeped into my bones, even in the stale cabin air. No one else reacted to her. No flight attendant asked her to take her seat. No passenger turned to look. It was like she didn't exist. Except to me. I should probably back up. My name is Jason, I'm 34, and I've spent the last decade flying more than any human should. I work in corporate logistics, which means endless meetings in different cities, all connected by overpriced tickets and cramped airplanes. I've flown so much that I can recite safety demonstrations verbatim, recognize the snack options by the sound of their crinkling wrappers, and even guess turbulence intensity by the way my coffee ripples. But in all my years of flying, I've never experienced anything close to this. The first encounter was on a red-eye from Denver to Chicago. It was a full flight, packed with bleary-eyed passengers desperate for sleep. I had just dozed off when the turbulence hit, jolting me awake. That's when I saw her for the first time. At first, I thought she was just another passenger who had stumbled out of her seat. Maybe she was sick, or had spilled something and was trying to clean it up. But as the seconds dragged on, I realized she wasn't moving like someone alive. She drifted, not walked, down the aisle, her bare feet hovering just above the floor. I blinked hard, thinking I was imagining things, but she remained. She stopped near row 12, right by the emergency exit. Her head tilted to the side like she was listening to something, though the roar of the engines drowned out every other sound. Then, she turned her gaze toward me, her lips parting just enough to mouth a single word: jump. When I landed in Chicago, I chalked it up to exhaustion. I had barely slept the night before, and stress from work was eating me alive. Sleep deprivation could mess with your mind, I told myself. It was the only explanation that made sense. But then it happened again. 2 weeks later, I was on another late flight, this time to Seattle. I had been upgraded to an aisle seat, which was a small mercy, and the cabin lights were dimmed for the overnight journey. I was mid-sip of a lukewarm ginger ale when I felt it, the sudden, oppressive cold that seemed to wrap around my chest and squeeze. I glanced up, and there she was. This time, she wasn't standing in the aisle. She was in the window seat 2 rows ahead of me, her head turned toward the glass. The window was frosted with ice, but it didn't seem to bother her. Her hands, pale and skeletal, rested motionless on her lap, and her breath fogged the glass in rhythmic bursts. My heart slammed against my ribs. I wanted to say something, scream maybe, but my voice stuck in my throat. The businessman beside her continued typing on his laptop, oblivious. The elderly woman in the middle seat was flipping through a magazine, unfazed. I forced myself to look away, but my eyes kept flicking back to her, terrified she'd disappear, only to reappear closer. She didn't move. Not until the plane jolted with another bout of turbulence. When it did, her head snapped back, turning toward me with an impossible speed. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, and her empty eyes drilled into mine. "You'll never land." I spent the rest of that flight clutching the armrests, convinced the plane was about to crash. Every slight shift of the cabin made me flinch, and by the time we touched down safely in Seattle, my body was shaking like a leaf. I couldn't let it go after that. What I had seen, who I had seen, wasn't normal, and it wasn't a one-off hallucination. She was real, or at least, real enough to haunt me. I started researching, spending hours online digging through forums, message boards, and obscure aviation lore. That's when I stumbled upon stories eerily similar to mine. People, mostly frequent flyers, described encounters with a phantom woman who appeared during flights. Some said she looked like a drowned corpse. Others claimed she whispered warnings about crashes or disasters. A few even said she had saved them by making them miss doomed flights. But the most disturbing accounts? Those came from passengers who claimed she touched them. They said her cold, wet hand left burns on their skin, marks that didn't fade. And in every story, the same detail repeated. She only appeared to those flying alone. By the time my next flight rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. It was a short hop from Los Angeles to Phoenix, just an hour in the air, but I dreaded every second of it. I tried everything to distract myself, noise-canceling headphones, podcasts, even pretending to sleep. It didn't work. Halfway through the flight, the cabin temperature dropped sharply. I could see other passengers pulling blankets tighter around themselves, shivering, but no one said anything. My breath fogged up the air in front of me, and then she was there. This time, she was closer than ever, standing directly beside my row. Her wet hair hung limp over her face, and her arms dangled lifeless effortlessly at her sides. Water dripped steadily from her fingers, pooling at her feet. I pressed myself back into my seat, heart pounding, but I couldn't look away. She leaned toward me, her face inches from mine. Her breath was icy, smelling of salt and decay. "They didn't listen," she whispered. Her voice was like the wind over water, soft but piercing. "Don't be like them." Before I could respond, the turbulence hit, hard. The plane bucked violently, sending passengers into panicked screams. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling and the captain's voice blared over the intercom trying to keep us calm. And then she was gone. We landed safely in Phoenix, but I knew I couldn't keep doing this. She wasn't going to stop. Whatever she was, ghost, warning, hallucination, she had latched onto me. I started avoiding flights, opting for trains, buses, anything to stay grounded. For months, it worked. The nightmares stopped, and the suffocating fear began to fade. I convinced myself that I had escaped her. Until tonight. I'm writing this from a plane, a last-minute red-eye from New York to London. My boss insisted I attend an international meeting, and there was no way to refuse without jeopardizing my job. I told myself it would be fine. It had been months since I'd seen her. Maybe she'd moved on. But the cabin's growing colder now, and the lights are flickering in a way that has nothing to do with turbulence. The businessman across the aisle has fallen into an unnatural, motionless sleep, and the flight attendants are nowhere to be seen. I can hear the steady drip of water somewhere behind me, growing louder with each passing second. She's here, and this time, I don't think she's leaving. It started with the scratching. Faint at first, like a rat's claws against the old stone foundation of my childhood home. I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing. Houses make noises, especially ones as old as ours. But the sound didn't stop. Night after night it grew louder, sharper, and more deliberate, like nails raking across the basement walls. I told myself it wasn't real. But by the fifth night, I had to know. The basement door stood at the end of the narrow hallway. It always had a weight to it, like it wasn't just a door but a portal to some other place. I had avoided going down there since I moved back to take care of my mother. After she passed 6 months ago, the basement had remained untouched. Whatever was causing the noise, I figured, would probably be something explainable. Maybe a raccoon or a broken pipe. But as I stood at the top of the stairs, the cold draft seeping up from below hit me like a warning. I gripped the flashlight tighter in my hand, took a breath, and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, wet earth and rot, as though the basement had been sealed off for decades. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the steep wooden stairs. Each creak of the steps beneath my feet echoed ominously. The scratching had stopped. "Hello?" I called out, feeling ridiculous the moment the word left my mouth, as if I expected a response. Silence. I scanned the basement. The concrete floor was cracked and uneven. Rusted tools hung on the walls, a relic of my father's DIY projects from decades ago. And then, tucked in the corner, I saw it. The hole. It hadn't been there before. A jagged gap in the concrete floor, no bigger than a manhole, surrounded by chunks of broken stone. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I stepped closer. The hole wasn't just deep, it was endless. The beam of light couldn't reach the bottom, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, faint, breathy, and unmistakable. "Help me." I froze. The voice was weak, fragile, but it was there. "Who's down there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No answer, just a cold, guttural laugh that crawled up my spine like ice. I backed away, nearly tripping over an old toolbox. The laugh stopped, replaced by a new sound. Wet, deliberate scraping, like something heavy being dragged against stone. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart raced as I locked it, pressing my ear against the wood. Nothing. No scratching. No whispers. just the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. For a moment, I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was the stress, the loneliness of living in this house again. But that night, the sounds came back. Scratching, dragging, and worse, footsteps. By the third week, I had stopped sleeping. Every night, the noises grew more intense. Furniture upstairs would shift on its own, lights would flicker, and doors would slam shut. I even called an exterminator, hoping they'd find a nest of some kind. But the man left pale and shaken, refusing to go back down after hearing something breathing in the darkness. That's when I decided to board it up. It took me hours. I nailed heavy planks over the basement door, sealing it off entirely. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. I even managed to sleep that night, lulled by the silence. But the next morning, the boards were gone. Not broken, not splintered, just gone, as if they'd been neatly removed and set aside. The basement door was wide open, and on the floor, leading up the stairs, were muddy footprints. They weren't human. The prints were elongated, with clawed toes that dug into the wood like talons. I didn't know who to call. The police? An exorcist? A therapist? None of them would believe me. Instead, I tried ignoring it. I locked the door again and shoved the heaviest piece of furniture I could find in front of it. But that night, it escalated. I woke to the sound of something pacing outside my bedroom. Thud. 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 I gripped the baseball bat I had started keeping under my bed, willing myself to breathe. The pacing stopped. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, it said my name. Ethan. It was guttural, warped, like a recording played backward. My throat tightened and I squeezed the bat until my knuckles turned white. "Go away," I screamed. The voice laughed again, the same cold, joyless laugh I had heard in the basement. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I knew I couldn't stay in the house. I packed a bag, threw it in the car, and drove to a motel an hour away. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. But safety was short-lived. I woke to find the motel room window open, the curtains billowing in the wind. On the bedside table was something that didn't belong, a clump of wet black hair. I couldn't run from it. Whatever was in that basement wasn't bound to the house. It had followed me, and now it was everywhere. When I returned home, the house was silent, too silent. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old structure were gone. I walked in cautiously, my heart pounding. The basement door was open. The hole in the floor had grown. It was no longer a small gap. It spanned nearly the entire basement. Something stood at the edge of it. It was tall, impossibly tall, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it crouched over the void. Its skin was gray and slick, like something pulled from the depths of the ocean. Its head twisted toward me and I saw its face, or rather the lack of one. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, featureless surface. It moved toward me with a jerking, unnatural gait, its limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. "Why won't you leave me alone?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. The creature stopped. It tilted its head as if considering my question. Then in that same distorted voice, it spoke. "You open the door." I don't know what it meant. I still don't. I fled the house that night and never went back. It's been years, and I've tried to rebuild my life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it. Scratching, dragging, whispers from the dark, and I know it's still waiting for me, in that basement, in that hole, the creature that won't leave.